Hey guys, what's up? Today I'm going to be showing you guys all how I go about making my Star Wars Clone Trooper figures. I'm thinking I'm going to do something like a 3-part series. This first episode is going to be centered on materials, what stuff you need to actually get started. The second part is going to be centered more on sort of software stuff, programs, where to find 3D files, people who sell 3D prints, just general things that you don't need to purchase anything, you can just find it typically. And then the last part is actually going to be a step-by-step tutorial. However, in order for this not to be a 3-hour long adventure, I'm going to start off simple by just showing you guys what I use to make these guys. In front of me I have a little variety, a little showcase of some of my favorite figures I have. I have Alpha 17 in his Phase 2 armor, my take on the Battlefront 2 Jet Trooper, this pretty obscure Bark Trooper from a comic, the Battlefront 2 Sharpshooter, and the Clone Engineer, just to show you guys kind of the wide variety of different clone characters you can make. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so first up, let's talk about what you need to actually get started, the base figure. So there's a couple different options for what kind of base figures you can use. You can use a variety of Clone Troopers Hasbro's made. You can use Bandai model kits. You can use figure arts, a ton of different figures you can use. However, I prefer to use the newer model Hasbro Clone Troopers, specifically the Phase 1 ones. Because if you start using the Shock Troopers or the 212 Clone Troopers, you run the risk of having really colorful parts that you have to use multiple layers of paint to mask over. So I really prefer these just plain white Phase 1 Clone Troopers. You can also get knockoffs off of AliExpress. This is actually a knockoff, and this is a legitimate one that I got from Hasbro. However, the knockoffs just have some general kind of oddities about their sculpt. That means that I prefer to use the actual official sculpt rather than the AliExpress ones. However, if you're a beginner customizer or you're not too anal about the details and you care more about price rather than really fine-tuned details, the AliExpress clones are great. Just me as someone who's super picky about small details, I always have to say to use the legitimate Hasbro Phase 1 Clone Troopers. So whenever I do my clone customs, I always like to take them apart into all their little pieces. This makes it much easier to actually paint them, mask them, and customize them. Like this little guy right here, so I got his torso, I got his helmet, I got his arm pieces. I like to take them apart. I don't recommend using hot water because hot water can sometimes cause parts to yellow. It can cause them to burn if you're not careful. So what I always recommend using is actually just any old blow dryer. It doesn't need to be fancy. Just set the blow dryer on hot, high, and let it go. And then once it's on high, you can actually rip out the limbs. If you don't use a blow dryer, you can actually cause some of the little pegs to break or snap. Additionally, one thing I like to do that not everyone does, but I like to do is I like to actually separate the torso and the abdomen piece. Like that, I like to actually cut it. So in order to cut it, I recommend using a piece of pliers. You just go in right in from the back and just cut it in the back. What that allows you to do is that allows you to lower the torso. That effectively makes the clones look a lot more like they do in the actual movies rather than the Hasbro sculpt, which has a really long torso. So I definitely recommend a pair of pliers just so you can cut them off in the back to lower that torso. So next in my process is that I like to mask the clone figures for painting. There's quite a few different pieces of tape you can use, but you can never go wrong with nice yellow masking tape. You can get the Tamiya brand, or Hobby Lobby also sells a variant that you can use. I usually use the Hobby Lobby kind. The only thing I would say is that, at least what I've seen, is that the Hobby Lobby tape has sort of rough edges. So I'll normally buy a wider piece of tape and actually cut it using an X-Acto knife or a roller to actually get really straight lines for masking. Additionally, if you're doing a character who has some sort of curved design of curved armor, you can actually buy curved tape. Tamiya sells it on Amazon. It's just white curved masking tape, and it's perfect for getting those intricate curvy details. The smaller the better, because it allows you to get more of a curve in. However, the downside of this stuff is that it's not very sticky, so I tend not to use it. If I can, I'll either usually just hand paint or I'll use the yellow stuff because it's a lot better. The next product I recommend buying are little skewers, especially ones with clips. These are awesome for actually setting up pieces that you want to paint. You can just put them on these little skewers and it makes it super easy just to use an airbrush and just paint very quickly and efficiently without getting your hands too dirty and without getting things too messy. I get these from Hobby Lobby and they're awesome. All right, let's talk about primer. So whenever I paint clones, usually let's talk about white clones. However, you can also do something unique and do a silver clone, but I normally start off with doing at least one coat of Vallejo Gray 74.601 surface primer. This stuff's great just to get a nice first layer on everything and make it all nice and uniform. After that, then I'll normally go ahead and just go straight with the 74.600 Vallejo white surface primer. This stuff is the color I use for my default clone armor. It doesn't exactly match the white Hasbro plastic. However, I prefer that, as the Hasbro plastic has a sort of pinkish tone to it, which doesn't quite match what we see in the movies. Using this nice white surface primer gets you that sort of matte white look that we see in Revenge of the Sith. So for actually painting your clones, especially the base layer, you have a variety of options. Some people prefer hand painting, and that's fine. However, me personally, if I'm doing something like a white layer or a black layer, just that base layer over the entire clone, what I tend to use is an airbrush. It just makes things a lot faster and ensures a really smooth, clean paint application. You can get a $40 airbrush with a compressor off of eBay. Those work great. Or you can spend a little bit more money and get a fancier airbrush. The one thing I would recommend is that whatever airbrush you get, especially if you're first starting off, I'd highly recommend getting an airbrush that's gravity fed, meaning that there's a little sort of reservoir on the top that you pour paint into, and it uses that directly. There's other airbrushes that are siphon fed, and those are just a little bit more complicated. I just recommend you get a gravity fed one with that little tank on top. Additionally, if you get an airbrush, you're also going to need to get a compressor. Some airbrushes come with a mini compressor, or you can just buy one online. I just bought one online. It does a good job. You don't need to get too fancy with this. Just any compressor will do. For painting the details of your clones, I highly recommend Vallejo Model Color or Vallejo Air. I know other people also use Citadel. Citadel is a great brand. Army Painter is also a fantastic brand. I'd recommend staying away from like Walmart brands like Apple Barrel. I would highly recommend Vallejo. Vallejo is awesome, and especially their Model Air line is pretty thin, so you don't have to water down their paints. If you use the Model Color line, you do need to mix it with a bit of water. If you're using your airbrush, I definitely recommend some airbrush thinner or water just to dilute it to make it a nice milky consistency. That way paint application is smooth. Sometimes you'll see people who or beginners of customs and are making a figure, and you can see really strong like paint streaks or like paintbrush lines, probably because they either chose a very cheap brand of paint or they decided not to water down their paint. So always use a brand of paint that either is pre-thinned or one that you can water down like Vallejo. So for doing a regular clone, if you want to do a regular phase 1 clone, colors I recommend is Surface Primer Black. You don't need to thin this, it comes pre-thin, so you can just paint it straight on. And neutral gray for doing those gray highlights like on the teeth or around the helmet band or on the back of the knee bands. Neutral gray is a perfect color for doing all of those. So once you actually have your clone fully painted, one of the most important parts of doing it is weathering. I feel like weathering can often make or break a figure. So often I see people weather too heavily or weather too light, it looks too clean. So I'm going to share my preferred method of weathering and what you need. I like to use stippling. I like to use these little sponge brushes. What I effectively do is I basically just put a little bit of paint on and I try and just wipe it off as much as possible. So I have as little paint on the sponge as possible. And I just like to lightly dab. In order to do this, what I typically use is this color called German Field Gray. This is Vallejo 70.830 model color. And I like to mix this with maybe some black or maybe a bit of brown. And what this basically allows me to do is just get a nice color that is a lot kind of like the Hot Toys 501st clone. It's kind of a nice sort of beige-ish dark gray color that allows you to really bring out some of those details without looking too overbearing, like using a straight black. A question I see people bring up a lot of times is, what kind of paintbrushes do you use? Do I need to go out and buy some sort of fancy paintbrushes? And I would say absolutely not. I tend to just go to Michael's, Hobby Lobby, even Walmart, and I'll just buy whatever their cheapest brush set is with the smallest brushes or sometimes larger brushes. You really don't need to get too fancy with these. Using acrylic paint, you're probably going to burn out your brushes in even a couple days if you customize as frequently as I do. So don't get too fancy with the brushes. Just cheap ones always will work. I spoke earlier about lowering the torsos on clone troopers. The Hasbro sculpt is a little bit too tall, so I like to lower that torso down to make them look more like they do in Revenge of the Sith. In order to do that, I really only use 3 things. I use the bolt colors I showed you earlier. I also like to use some, I believe this is 1/16 inch memory wire. It's a really strong, rigid wire. What it allows you to do is allows you to thread it inside of the torso and essentially make a stronger joint. I also recommend using a drill with a 1/16 drill bit to actually make those holes in the top and bottom of the torso, and then a hot glue gun to actually secure the memory wire. But this is a great way to make your clone look a bit more realistic and not have such a high torso. One thing I get asked a lot about is how to make camas. Camas, of course, is the cool nerd sci-fi name for the skirts that the clones wear in the Clone Wars, Revenge of the Sith, just these cool little skirts they wear. My favorite go-to is using something from Hobby Lobby called broadcloth. Broadcloth isn't too fancy. It's just a nice little thin piece of cloth that has a good sort of knit to it. It looks almost like a smaller version of canvas. And what this does is it allows it to give a good illusion of scale. So it effectively looks like real life canvas, but shrunk down to the size that was realistic for a clone trooper that's only 6 inches tall. You can actually just go to Hobby Lobby and buy these by the feet, by the yard. I tend to just buy by the foot because you get a lot of it and it's super cheap. The only thing I'd recommend is that when you cut this out, I like to use, I'll use fabric scissors, or I'll use a straight edge with it's basically like a pizza roller you can use to cut fabric. It's awesome. The one thing I would say about fabric is that after you end up cutting this out, and what I tend to use for this is I make a stencil. I'll have the link to the stencil in the description, but it's basically something I made by just testing it on clone troopers to kind of get the correct sizing. So I make a stencil. I tend to put the stencil on the fabric like that. I tape it down, and then I'll lightly airbrush the stencil onto the fabric. I'll take it off and I'll trim it with my fabric scissors. And once you have it trimmed, I'd highly advise getting some sort of maybe old paintbrush you don't use, putting a little bit of super glue on it and just treating the edges. What that allows you to do is prevent it from fraying. If you don't use some sort of super glue on it, and this guy didn't quite do enough on it, that fabric will start to fray, and over time it'll kind of unravel. So in order to protect against that, I strongly advise using super glue on the edges. You can also use something like nail polish, or maybe like a varnish, some sort of varnish like this, just something in order to get that skirt not to fray as much. A lot of clones, especially in Revenge of the Sith, have really interesting straps they have on their bodies. They have little pouches, like the clone sharpshooter, or like Alpha 17. He has that sort of, he has that strap with ammo on it, similar to Bly. Or this clone jet trooper, similar to Gree, has like suspenders. In order to make those, what I tend to use is, this is 1/8 inch ribbon. This one specifically made of polyester, but just 1/8 inch ribbon. I tend to buy this on eBay, is a good source for it. And you can basically use it for all sorts of things. For little straps like on the shoulders, you can use them for straps like on his bicep ammo band. You can use them for like these little suspenders that the jet trooper wears. A lot of different options for this stuff, and it's really useful. I tend to prefer there's like a light gray color you can get, and it's really easy to just airbrush on. If you need a black one, you can airbrush it black. If you need a white one, you can airbrush it white. There's loads of different ways you can use it in different ways. I also recommend using 1/8 inch, this is elastic ribbon. What this is useful for is you have something where you need a little bit more flex. Like for instance, I see people use it a lot of times for if you want to put on a pistol holster like Rex has. This 1/8 inch elastic ribbon is perfect for that. And again, you can find this on eBay specifically normally. You can also maybe find these in like a Hobby Lobby, but I tend to get them straight from eBay. Next up, I'd like to talk about decals. Decals are incredibly useful. They're, I wouldn't say replacement for painting. I've seen some people do that though. I would say it's just another tool. My favorite decals that I use, because they're super easy to get and they're very accessible, are these water transfer decal paper from Hobby Lobby. You get 6 sheets of it and you can use it with inkjet printers. I tend to make my own decals. I can link them in the description. Those are for things like on clones, they have those little stripes on their cheeks. I tend to use Hobby Lobby decals I make myself for that. Or like on Commander Neo, he has all these crazy, intricate little 91st recon symbols on him. I too made little decals for those. I sized them properly, and I just printed them out my inkjet printer and then put them on. The one thing I'll say is that if you do make a decal, like these ones I use for the Bark Trooper helmet, for those little cheek stripes, and for the mouthpiece, always make sure you seal it. So I prefer to use Krylon UV resistant acrylic coating clear gloss. This is a great gloss varnish that'll actually protect it. If you don't treat this decal paper before you apply it, it'll just completely wipe away. So UV resistant acrylic coating gloss is perfect for that. So for actually coating a figure once you finish painting it, I usually do a 2-step process with 2 sealers. I use the UV resistant clear acrylic coating gloss first, because gloss is a protective varnish. Putting a gloss spray onto a figure will actually give it a bit of a protective coating so it won't nick or scratch. After I've done at least 1 coat of this gloss varnish, sometimes I'll even do 2, then I put on a matte coat. I use Krylon UV resistant clear acrylic coating matte. This allows the armor to get sort of a matte look, more like that in Revenge of the Sith, versus having a shiny Stormtrooper-like look. You can choose if you want to not use a matte coat. I would just always suggest using a gloss varnish to protect it. Otherwise, your figure might scrape or the paint might scratch with handling it over time. The final thing I'll recommend is gloss varnish. Gloss varnish is super useful for actually giving that visor that realistic shine. All you have to do is just pour a little bit out and just use a small paintbrush to paint it in. It's a great way to add a little bit of extra dimension to your characters, especially after that matte coat. Using that gloss varnish really makes that visor pop and make it look realistic. All right, so before I wrap it up, I just want to share a couple other things just a little bit too big for me to bring to my living room table. The first was my 3D printer. I see a lot of people asking what kind of 3D printer should I get, what should I do this, what should I do that. What I would recommend, especially for a beginner, is the Lego Saturn printer. It's an awesome printer that's a good sizable print bed, so you can print lots of stuff, but it also is very simple and user-friendly. I think it's awesome. I use a Lego gray resin with it, and it's perfect. I use that to make a lot of my 3D printed pieces here. And I'll talk more in future videos about where I actually get those models from, where you can buy if you don't want to buy a printer, but just highly recommend the Lego series of printers, and you can't go wrong with the Saturn. Additionally, something I also recommend is if you want to use an airbrush, you want to use sealants, I highly recommend purchasing a spray booth. I got mine off of Amazon, and it is fantastic. It's great for having a safe place that you can actually airbrush your figures without being too worried about inhalation of the toxic particles from it. Well, that about wraps up this video. I'm sure there's quite a few things that I probably left out or forgot about, and for that I apologize. If you have any questions regarding customizing, please feel free to hit me up in the comments and I'll do my best to respond. I'd like to remind you again, this is the first episode in hopefully a 3-part series where I can actually go and further develop on this. I just wanted to start off with putting out all the materials I use. So if you want to try and do exactly what I do, you can actually buy those. So by the time I actually end up doing a tutorial, you'll have everything on hand and won't have to run out to the store and buy things that you're missing. Until next time, peace.